Right. As I said, Safewards is an intervention that looks about making a ward community safer. Now, thinking of that ward community, we think about it in terms of two groups of people. This is not an intervention that's for individual patients or indeed individual staff. This is a community intervention. It asks for the whole community to take part. And that community we divide into two groups: the staff group, the people being paid, the people who are qualified, the people who are there to carry out a specific function and are very pleased to do that. And of course, the other group, the patient group, patients who are there, people who are there to be cared for. And one of the very clear things about Safewards is that we treat patients as an active group. These are active agents who we believe can contribute actively to any intervention that's trying to make wards safer. But as I suspect, we are probably talking to a majority of the staff group. And if you are a patient, or if you have been a patient, then some of this, I think, sit it out. You don't need to go through this trip of the imagination. You've already been through it. But for all of us who are staff, I want us to take a trip of an imagination. I want us to think of a ward very much from the patient experience. Now, in this, I think, take care of yourself. Obviously, I'm asking you to access thoughts about people who are in acute distress. So if that makes you uncomfortable, or if in any way that kind of reflects on your own kind of experience, then just make yourself safe. You don't do it, or switch off this bit, whatever. I can't be in a room with you, so I can't kind of take care of you in that way. But just I give you permission to look after yourself. Because obviously when we talk about inpatient wards, they are actually receptacles of people in deep suffering and indeed often deep trauma. But I want us to take a trip of the imagination and imagine going to either the ward you work on or wards you're acquainted with. And I want you to imagine that you're arriving there not as a staff member, but as a patient. You're not arriving there to work, you're arriving there to get care. And I always talk about wards as that the wards have a threshold. There's a kind of point of admission, a point of entry, the threshold to the ward. And I want us just for a second to think about how our patients arrive at that threshold, because they arrive at that threshold in truly awful and traumatic circumstances. Being admitted to an inpatient psychiatric unit, the kind of places I worked, was for the vast majority of people a truly awful and dreadful experience. In order to even get to that threshold, truly terrible things had happened to them, either in their lives or internally in what was actually happening in their mind. So they could have been somebody who was for months had becoming more and more isolated in a family home, locking themselves in a room, not talking to their family, to the point that the family became extremely anxious, called somebody else in. In England, they could have been sectioned, which means that other people would have come to their house, would have talked to them, would have told them that they were leaving. If they didn't want to go, they had the right to forcibly remove them. And now they've been taken to this place. And that process they may have understood and they may not have understood. So we could be arriving there as somebody who's gone through that kind of process. We could also have been taken to accident and emergency department in the UK and met by professionals and had lots of talk, and eventually it's been decided again that we're coming to this place. And again, if we don't want to, we can be coerced, we can be forced to come to this place against our will. We could have the night before, we could have decided that our life was so terrible, that the world would be better off without us, our families would be better off without us, and we made a very serious attempt to end our own lives, and we were unsuccessful. We woke up in a hospital department surrounded by apparatus. People were very concerned about us. We weren't able to reassure them. And again, we've come to this place from that experience. We may have been seriously traumatized in various ways when we were younger, and while we're desperately trying to cope with that in our everyday life, just at the moment, that's too difficult, and people have become so concerned. Again, they've brought us to this place. These are the stories, these are the narratives, these are the experiences that our patients arrive at our threshold with. And as staff, there's absolutely, well, unless we work outside, as staff, there is very little, if anything, we can do about that. People arrive at our threshold the way they arrive. And there's very little that we can do to affect how they arrive or what's happened to them before. What we can control is once they step over their threshold and enter into our community. But let's be under no illusion that people arrive at our wards in dreadful states. And if this is their first admission, as patients have often said to me in reflection, this is probably the worst day of their lives to date. So that's the reality of a patient walking onto many of our units, many of our patients walking onto many of our units. And what we want for them is to have a slightly different experience almost from the minute they step over that threshold. What we're trying to create is an environment that gives a signal, which we would call, I suppose, the safe word signal. So staying in that moment, here you are as a patient, you're arriving at this isn't your choice, and you're staying here. You're not going to go home at the end of it. You are staying here, and you don't know for how long, and you're stepping over the threshold, and you're walking into the ward. As you get onto the ward, you have to wait. All patients that we research say that there's a period of waiting, there's a period of admission, there's a period of processing that goes on. They may or may not know that they're being processed, but that is the admission for staff is about clerking them in, all that kind of stuff. But what the patient will experience is just they have to wait somewhere. And they're waiting in this ante area of the ward, or a room in the ward that's specifically designed for people who are being admitted, and they're sitting there. They might be with a family member, they might not, they might be with the police, they might be with somebody else, but they're sitting in this space. And in this kind of imaginary admission, they are looking at something on the walls that's interesting, something on the walls that's very dramatic, something on the walls that they may, a staff member even may point them out to, or maybe their carer or the person with them might go up and start reading it, and eventually they may get curious and they may go and have a look. And there's a little sign saying that this is messages from other patients, people who've been on the ward, and they start to read them, and it says, staff very helpful, good days and bad. And apparently the ward does a really nice chicken curry. Now, this is not making you feel brilliant, but it's just interesting. It's just something that's there in the environment. And this is from other patients, people like you who've been on the ward, and you're reading about them. And there's another one that says that I've improved in my mental health and have become informal. Now, you may be aware that you're on a section, and this is somebody who came in a section and then became informal. So that might give you some comfort if you're thinking, I don't want to be in a section, or this place is, this is a prison, I'm going to be locked up here for 6 months. This is somebody who that obviously wasn't the case. And this is somebody else who's obviously a carer and has written about the support the ward has given their family. Now, you know, none of this is making you feel brilliant, but it's just there, and you're reading it, and it's just stopping the kind of waiting process, and you're kind of just taking it in this awful day. And then eventually sit down, and on the table you notice a folder. The folder says, this ward's called Connolly Ward, and the folder says it's getting to know you. And you know, you're still waiting. You're going to have to wait for some time. Somebody might have brought you a cup of tea, but you've got nothing else to do. So you open the folder and you start to flick through it. You find that these are about people. And this is some guy called Jeff Brennan, who's a staff nurse on the ward. Looks like a bit of he supports, he likes football and rugby and whiskey. Don't like the sound of this guy. You don't like football. You've never liked football. Just likes suits, but he likes reading. So yeah, fair enough. He's okay. That's him. And oh, this is the ward manager, a guy called Len Bowers. And you're reading through this, and oh, this is more. Actually, there's some things here. He plays the flute, and you like music, and you play some music yourself. That's interesting. So he's the ward manager. He's the guy in charge, and you're just reading through that, and you notice, and there's others in there. There's quite a few. It's quite a thick folder. And then you notice that there's other ones. So this guy's some Australian, I think, who's been admitted to the ward, because that's an Australian football sign at the bottom. Doesn't say he's a staff member. It's interesting. Sons of Anarchy. Oh, that's interesting. You know, that's something you like to. Anyway, you know, this is just distraction. You're just distracting your head, and you're reading these things and just looking at this book. And then you kind of notice that it's people on the ward. So this is obviously people on the ward, people who you're going to meet. Anyway, it's distracted you for a few minutes, but now it's time to move on. And the staff member comes and says, look, come on, step through to the ward. We're all ready for you now. We're just going to get a room and I'm going to just take you onto the ward and get you a cup of tea. And they take you in. He says, look, just sit there while I go and make your tea and then we'll go off and have a chat. And as you sit there, you see that there's people across and they're sitting in a group and it's a fairly big group. And the nurse who's gone off tells you that it's the mutual help meeting, something held in the morning, and you definitely don't want to join. It's just absolutely in no fucking mood to go over and talk to people. But they're sitting there and they seem quite having a cup of tea and they all seem quite happy. And at the moment they're all saying thank you to each other. And there's a poster on the wall and there's a little clipping underneath it. So you have a look at the poster and you think, okay, fair enough. Don't know what that's all about, but underneath it there's a clipping about the meeting and somebody's put it up and it's, I'd like to thank this lady for ironing my trousers, says one grateful service user to another. And then somebody's talking about the meeting you were looking at. General feeling of camaraderie on the ward. Other topics, okay, fair enough. So the ward seems to be somewhere that I don't know, they have these meetings. Well, I don't know what that means, but at the moment, they're having one and things are going on and they all seem fairly happy and all the rest of it. And then the nurse comes back and says, right, come on. We're all ready for you. We've got a room, so let's take you in here. Bring your tea. My name's Jack, and I'm gonna kind of take you through the admission. Really sorry you're here. And as you get in, there's a banging, and you can hear somebody, "Fuck off, go away!" And you kind of, and the nurse sees you kind of reacting to this, and he says, "Look, he tells you that's a man named Jack. He's trying to manage his distress, and he occasionally has to shout to let out his frustration." And he says, look, we're all used to Jack, but we know it must be frightening for anyone who's new to the ward. Look, he really is a nice guy, although hearing him shout, you probably don't believe me and probably find that hard to believe. Look, we get how difficult it is being here. We'll try and check in with you if there's anything make you feel uncomfortable, but if anything does, do feel free to approach us. We do know how hard it is to be in this new environment. And you go, okay, fair enough. And you're sitting there and he's getting all his stuff and he starts to go through the questions, and you've done this 3 times before, but he seems like a nice guy, and this is just the process. So you're going through the questions: where do you live? Who's your GP? What are you thinking? And you're looking around though, because there's moments kind of between it, and he sees you looking at a sign on the wall, and the sign on the wall says, "Be flexible. It's not always necessary for the patient to do exactly what you tell them," with this weird sign about safe word. So he sees you looking at it and he says, oh yeah. He said, that's a little bit of advice about how best to talk to each other. And it's mainly for us. It's mainly for us staff. We have to remind ourselves about the good stuff. So we have loads of others, and you will see different ones while you're here. We find them a useful reminder just about how we should all talk to each other. And you go, okay, fair enough. And your admission proceeds and the questions come, but this guy's all right, actually, and you're beginning to feel hopefully just a little bit less lost, a little bit less alone. But there comes a point where you're going to have to go out and you're going to have to engage with the ward on your own terms. So the nurse takes you out into the lounge. And he leaves you in front of a huge poster. It's massive over the television. And he says to you, look, he says, I know it's a lot to take in today, but when you have time, do have a look at this. It's what we expect of each other on this ward in this community. Staff and other patients here have signed up to it. And we do try our best to keep to it. See what you think. I must go now. The ward manager is a bloody slave driver. I'll see you around if you need me. So you're left in front of the poster, and with nothing else to do, with your cup of tea drunk, you're just kind of flicking over it, and you read through it, and it all looks fair enough. It's but it's interesting that he said that the staff and the patient signed up to it. So this is something that the ward it looks like this is how the ward wants people to be with each other, and that's fair enough. And it just looks like they've had a very interesting conversation. It'd be very interesting to see if they actually stick to this,
But anyway, that's what they say. Right, I want to stop there. Because what we've and it's an idealized situation. I'm not saying this is a ward I know. I'm not saying this is a patient experience I can guarantee has happened. We have had some very positive feedback from patients about how Safewards react on them. But all we've imagined in this world is 6 of the 10 Safewards interventions. What were they? Discharge messages, those messages at the start. They were written, patients' messages of hope, support and advice, written by patients for other patients, not written by staff. They have to be written by patients, and they have to be hopeful, they have to be supportive, and they have to contain advice, because we know about admission shock. We know how awful it is to be admitted. So discharge message is a direct intervention where one patient can help each other, because patients know admission shock and we don't. Know each other is an icebreaker. We know that patients, particularly when they're admitted, very much value ordinary conversation that isn't just all about them being a patient. Most of the admission process and most of our conversations with patients are about their symptoms, their illness, and about how we can help them. But they very much value ordinary conversation. This is from I stole this quote from Michael Schultz just because. And it's from a German service user, and I just think it sums up very much what we're trying to counteract. A person cannot be more devalued than to be considered unworthy or incapable of conversation. That's not what we want for ourselves or our patients or our wards. The mutual help meeting, that is a meeting where patients are encouraged to help each other. But also, and most importantly, as you saw from the clipping, thanks. Patients who help each other, patients who help the ward deserve and should be thanked. And we've set up a meeting to guarantee that a ward has an opportunity to make that happen. The mutual help meeting is a place where patients can receive positive affirmation for any positive contribution they're making to the ward. There's a lot of difficulties within the patient group, which I don't need to go through, but what we're trying to do is to affirmatively thank people and focus on the fact that they can help each other. Reassurance. It's I can honestly say that I worked on wards for 15, 20 years, and there were times where I was desensitized. It's my working environment, I'm used to it. I go in there, things are happening, and I don't bat an eyelid. That is not the experience of patients, and they often don't know what's going on. Don't have access to information. So the bit of explanation about that man, that person who was shouting being a nice person and actually trying to manage his symptoms, is reassurance. It's about, look, I know you will be anxious, but I'm trying to reassure you as much as possible that you're not imminently going to be attacked. And softwords. Staff are brilliant at communicating, but not always. There are moments, there are times when we are less good than we should be. 35% of incidents that lead to a conflict situation from a patient point of view are predicated by less than optimal staff communication. That's a big mouthful that basically says there are times when we are abrupt with patients, we ignore patients, or we just get it wrong, and that can cause issues for patients. And we are just looking to, staff are brilliant. We're just looking to say, look, just be careful, particularly in moments when we have to ask the patient to do something they don't want to do, when we have to ask them to stop doing something they do want to do, or when we have to deny a request, even if it's for a reasonable reason. Patients are highly sensitive in those moments, as we would be, and we need to be very careful how we communicate. And lastly, clear mutual expectations. I always call this the Northern Irish Peace, being Northern Irish, I always call this the Northern Irish Peace Agreement, where you've got two communities that have to work out a way to live together in this lovely place. I'm not sure your wards are lovely, but Northern Ireland's lovely. But anyway, it's about that negotiation taking as long as it can. Rules and structure are things that we need. They are very important for wards to be safe, but patients have very little say in that. We've put something else in there, clear mutual expectations, which they do have a say about, and they have an active say about, and they can talk about what do we expect, what does the staff group and the patient group expect from each other, and for that to be the mantra of the ward, and to be reviewed and changed depending on how things go. The interventions we didn't see were talk down tips, which is about one of our golden skills, one of our skills that a lot of people on wards are absolutely brilliant at, and that is de-escalation, good de-escalation, the ability to talk somebody down from a state of agitation or arousal just through communication
to a place that's where they can step down from their agitation without anybody being hurt or harmed. A real golden skill. People who are good at this, we need to recognize them, and we need to try and get everybody on the ward up to that level of skill. Comfort box. Patients have bad days, and sometimes we go to PRN as a method of managing that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's many people need that extra reassurance of the medication. But what we're trying to do is put something else in the pathway that both staff and patients can utilize that is non-medicalized. It's, as you would imagine, it's built around the senses. It's not sensory interventions are quite specified, and they're really, really wonderful. So this is a bit more crude, actually. This is just a box of stuff that people can use. A lot of people come along and say, oh, it's about sensory thing. We go, it could be if you're up to that, but if you're not that au fait with it, just put things in. So you can put coloring book, you can put whatever the ward wants in there that we just, and it's about distraction, it's about self-management. And most importantly, it's about staff and patients before PRN having a conversation in that space. Even if PRN is then used, the impact of that is the conversation and the offer. And the other two we didn't see were positive words, which is we are too many of my walking onto a ward to do a shift 7 hours, and the first thing somebody says to me is, oh, bloody hell, you wouldn't believe how awful it is here. And we just kind of go, don't say that. You know, how am I supposed to feel coming in 7 hours and somebody's telling me just how dreadful it is, how awful the patients are, about they're all a nightmare, they're crawling the walls, they're kicking off. That kind of language is demoralizing for patient staff that comes on. And often in that language, we will stigmatize patients, particularly people with trauma histories, personality disorders who self-harm, and people who use drugs and alcohol. So we're trying very carefully not to demoralize, not to stigmatize, and that's what positive words is about. And bad news mitigation is very similar to reassurance in that you saw that was reassurance. What would technically happen with that is that the person who was admitting me, let's say it was me that was being admitted, then in the handover would say, I needed some reassurance because I was obviously and understandably concerned about the shouting, and that somebody should check with me in the afternoon just to make sure if I'm still concerned or if there's any other reassurance. We know that reassurance needs to be increased when people are admitted. It then tends to fade off as patients get more comfortable on the ward. But in handover, we're just checking, did anything happen? Is there anything happening on the ward? Did we have to do some awful restraining of stuff? Did the people that see that, have they had some reassurance? Are we sure that the patients have an explanation of what's going on in the ward? And then, so that's reassurance. Bad news mitigation is very similar. We know that patients react understandably very badly when they receive bad news, and bad news comes from outside the hospital. It can be a phone call from a partner or a child or somebody, high state of agitation, or there's a bill arrived, or they're not well, or they're upset. And that can make the patient feel all sorts of things, and then they can react in all sorts of ways. So we're scanning for those kinds of things. It can also be CPNs coming in. There's been a review of their housing, something of that ilk, and their housing is going to be removed. So we know there's bad news arriving at that moment. They haven't got the tribunal result they wanted, and the doctor is going to go out and tell them. They haven't got the medication reduction they wanted. The doctor is going to go out and tell them. They haven't got the leave they wanted. The doctor is going to go out and tell them. Those are all bad news moments, and we are looking to somebody else to deliver the bad news, and then for us to also have somebody who can support the person who's received the bad news. We also know that bad news leads to conflict. So could this be your ward, and is it? I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions, because this isn't the presentation where I've got the other bits on, but that's fine. But I just have to say to you, and I can certainly send it to you, that we do have direct patient quotes about how some of these interventions are, from their point of view, are things that they certainly value, but also that they certainly change their experience, that by doing them, patients are saying to us that their experience of a ward has been changed. And to be honest, that's the effect. For, we can give you all the research statistics, but for me, that's the effect, and that's what we're trying to create. We cannot make wards perfectly safe. We cannot make people who are arriving on wards have a wonderful time. That would just be ridiculous. But we can make them safer, and we can make the experience for patients just a little less awful. And that's what Safewards is attempting to do. And I would even say that's what Safewards does. I'm going to stop sharing and just open it up for, because I think I was told short presentation, lots of questions. So I'm going to stop there and just